India and China are both growing in power and influence. How should the two countries manage their relationship for the good of the Indo-Pacific region? India's Foreign Secretary has paid frequent visits to the United States. India's expectations for the country's relations with the US in the era of Donald Trump. India has been a victim of terrorist attacks. What needs to be done to fight against the threat of terrorism in the region? As China's Belt and Road Initiative continues to gain momentum, how might it help to promote trust and integration in the region?
China is making huge efforts to promote both diplomatic and economic ties with its South Asian neighbors. As a major power, India plays a vital role in the stability of the region, and the Sino-Indian relationship affects much of importance in South Asia's ongoing peace and prosperity. To discuss the many issues related to China-India relations and South Asian security, I'm happy to be joined in the studio by C. Raja Mohan, Director of Carnegie, India.
As India rises on the global stage, the kind of relationship it has with China becomes the most important factor. China is already a great power. China can contribute to India's rise on the world stage, but a conflict between India and China would limit India's international prospects. So finding that cooperative relationship between India and China is very important.
And Youfa, former Chinese Consul-General in Mumbai.
China and India are the two neighbors that neither side can afford to treat the other side lightly. For that matter, it is very important for both countries to join hands to search and find the South-South cooperation modality so that we can both benefit the interest of the common development.
That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui. Welcome to Dialogue. Hat in hand, one after another, senior Indian security officials are traveling to the United States of America. Is it the beginning for you to reconsider the chronic policy of non-aligned movement? Because you're very influential as one of the leaders in this global movement. Today, with the rise of China, are you proactively reconsidering a change to this policy?
I think India is an independent actor in the international system, and it will remain one for the foreseeable future. The Indian leaders are to Washington these days very often just to figure out what the new administration means. So I don't think there's any special motivation here. Last 20 years, we've had improving relationship both with the United States and with China. And I think the change of administration, that particularly this one, which seems a bit difficult to understand, that's where the effort is at this point. Where exactly is this administration going? What is this relationship with the other countries in the world? That's where we are. But I don't think this has anything to do with India's independent foreign policy on the world stage.
What's your take?
India, since its independence, has implemented the policy of neutrality in terms of its foreign policy. This policy and strategy have remained unchanged. I don't suppose India would deviate from this policy, which has been making India a global power with global influence. However, Prime Minister Modi is taking the advantage of a new administration in the United States to seek more benefits of bilateral cooperation, which will be mutually beneficial both to India and the United States.
But I'm afraid the foreign policies of many of the neighboring countries of China are being measured and dictated on terms of two things. One is the rapid expansion of China's global stakes, and the other, pivot to Asia. Though President Donald Trump has never said clearly that it will adopt the legacy of the Obama administration in reassuring its influence in China and restricting the alleged assertiveness of a rising China, India has long considered China a strategic competitor in many ways. Now, do you think Prime Minister Modi, during his official visit to the United States, will prioritize his concern about China? And what do you think will be the most likely response from the Donald Trump administration?
If you know that some of the administration officials have now said there's no such thing as a pivot or a rebalance to Asia, So you have a new administration in Washington that seems to be discarding many of the previous administration's positions. So we don't know quite clearly where this administration is going to come out. And we're all looking forward to seeing what happens between President Xi and President Trump when they meet shortly in Florida in the coming days. As far as India is concerned, India wants good relationship with both the US and with China. And I think our challenge is, how do I maximize our gains in our engagement with both the countries, and to avoid any potential pitfalls that will come from either a collusion between America and China or a confrontation between Washington and Beijing.
Here are some concerns, I'm afraid, our Indian friends will have to take into consideration. One is part of the Sino-Pakistan economic corridor will inevitably pass the area in dispute, Kashmir, the line of control. And that has caused an uproar within the circle media, the media circles in your country. The other is China refuses to acknowledge or recognize one of the organizations in Pakistan as a terrorist organization. Yeah. And this has also caused some controversy. So what do you think of the potentials that may derail our relationship?
Exactly, and I think you touched on a very important point. India would essentially agree with the core objective of China's Belt and Road Initiative. India needs more infrastructure, India needs more connectivity, and it would seem a godsend that what China is doing in terms of promoting it through Belt and Road Initiative. But unfortunately, it goes through the China-Pakistan economic corridor, goes through a disputed territory between India and Pakistan. So I think just as China is so sensitive about its sovereignty, territorial sovereignty, India too is concerned. Therefore, I think India is saying we'll find it difficult to support the Belt and Road Initiative so long as it runs through a disputed territory.
Is this the Western media allegation or the media fanfare in India about the so-called Belt and Road Initiative that has to go through part of Kashmir? China has so far remained pretty quiet on this issue. What do you think of the debate?
The focus of the debate with regard to the passage of the Belt and Road Initiative, the initiative, passing through the disputed area between Pakistan and India, is that, to my research finding in India, relies on the fact that the Chinese side fails to discuss with the both Indian and Pakistani sides. And the second is our Indian friends are a little bit concerned about the real intention of this corridor jointly built by China and Pakistan. These are the two focal points.
You mean, in the other statement of our Indian friends' fears should be the issue of Gwadar, a deep water port that
Definitely.
may ship Persian oil through this port to Xinjiang, and that will, from the point of view of Indian security, would be a serious concern.
So I think, while we have no problem with the connectivity projects and Western China needs access to the Indian Ocean, the question is it purely a civilian initiative, or does it have strategic and security implications? And that's where I feel India and China have not had substantive consultations. I think India has largely been presented with the initiative. What we need is better understanding.
Youfa, this is indeed a serious issue for the Indian side. There's no doubt about that. However, do you think whether this is a military or civilian port largely depends on the process of rapprochement between Pakistan and India, which did have a good beginning a few years ago between Prime Minister Modi and his Pakistani counterpart. However, this process seemed to have come to a halt.
I think the original design of this economic belt, with the Gwadar port as the mouth, it is a energy transportation system which would eventually linking the countries in Central Asia, countries in Western Asia, where the oils and gas will be pulling together and redistributed to countries in China, India, and Pakistan, Afghanistan, and some other countries in Southeast Asia. But I think at the moment, our Indian friends are not sure yet how to approach I had the opportunity when I was talking to one of the generals, major generals in India. Their concern is, you haven't talked to us yet, and we have to be notified and be assured that this is a pure economic adventure, not with some, hidden agendas, quote unquote, behind. I think in this regard, Chinese side does need to approach our Indian authorities to explain specifically what this corridor will, what the benefits this corridor would bring to the countries along the countries in Southeast Asia and on the rim of Indian Ocean.
After all, India and China are two of the BRICS members. Mm-hmm. We share the same concern about the issue of development. That's a major issue for countries in the southern world. It's part of the South-South dialogue. However, the increasing uncertainty of the Donald presidency may ironically bring the two countries closer. For example, President Trump rose on the platform of populism and ideas like anti-establishment, anti-elites, anti-corruption, and anti-immigration. Two Indian-American engineers got killed recently in Kansas City. That caused strong protests from the Indian government. So it could be a part of the spillover effect of the anti-immigration tidal waves initiated by the Trump camp. What do you think of the uncertainty that may damage the mutual trust between Washington and New Delhi?
Look, I think the two slogans that Mr. Trump has had, Buy American, which is really an anti-globalization trend. And I think in India, which
Buy
is...
America and Hire America.
Yeah, coming to the second one. Buy American means anti-globalization, where India as a late globalizer will have a negative consequences. The globalization process is disrupted. Hire American means a large number of Indians who benefited from open door policies in the US today will find it hard because of the change in the nature of the visa policies. So these two are major problems for India, and I think we hope we can negotiate so that the consequences of a fundamental shift in the US would not be too difficult for us to manage in the coming years.
Well, I think for President Trump, Buy America is not a simple thing to do, because the U.S. has outsourced most of the production capabilities across the world. Whatever American products are mainly contributed by the Indian companies, concentrating on the software part from the Chinese side, the manufacturing side. So Buy America simply is buy from the world. So President Trump cannot do much in this regard. But Hire Americans is for sure a policy is going to stick, because people have to be American, for sure.
The issue is whether jobs will go back to the United States to assist the reindustrialization of American economy. And when labor costs are rising, commodity prices are rising in China, seriously undermining the legitimacy of multinationals in China, their presence here. Most of them are perhaps considering seriously whether they should relocate their R&D center from China to low-income economies like India. India is, of course, one of the catch-up economies. Do you think the Trump presidency and his appeal for buying America and hiring America will seriously affect your campaign to industrialize the Indian economy?
Look, I think as a slogan, it promises to threaten India's globalization. Now, what we don't know is how serious Mr. Trump is, because quite clearly within his administration, there are people from Goldman Sachs, there are people who want to continue the process of globalization. There are also economic nationalists like Steve Bannon or others who want a more inward-oriented policies. So the tension between the two, how it plays out, we'll see some of that in their engagement with China, some of it in the engagement with India. But I wouldn't at this point define quite clearly which is the direction. And here is a problem for Mr. Trump. He came to power by invoking the resentments of those who are losing jobs. But to succeed, he needs cooperation with other countries, especially China. And can he really confront them and lose even more jobs? That is the tension that he faces.
Perhaps India and China are sharing the same sense of uncertainty, given that neither country would make sure whether we should look at the personal use of Twitter or press release White House concerning his policy options. So do you share the same confusion?
Well, I think the policy statements and the reality of the economic trends sometimes are not working side by side. President Trump can say, oh, create more jobs for the American people, but the jobs are not, created by the governments. It is up for the transnational corporations that have the capacity to bring jobs back to the U.S., but right at the moment, I don't suppose the U.S.-based multinational corporations are ready to shift, because like Apple, cell phone, for example, their productions are across the world. So as the former CEO Jobs said, I cannot bring the jobs back to the U.S. myself. This is the truth.
Oh, this is our dollar, but your problem. You are watching Dialogue with Mr. C. Raja Mohan, Director of Carnegie, India, and Liu Youfa, former Chinese Consul-General in Mumbai. We're discussing bilateral relationship between India and China during the Trump era, as well as what the Put America policy actually means for the major economies in Asia, China and India. We'll be back in a short while. Please do stay with us. Welcome back, gentlemen. So, what will be done to mend the ties between India and China, which might have been frayed by the killing of one Indian-American engineer in Kansas? Such kind of spats would often occur between your two countries, like the body search of your former president, and that also caused India to be infuriated.
Look, I think there is a lot of random violence in the US, and at this point, a lot of people feel empowered. But I think there are contradictory trends. For example, this election saw 4 Indian Americans get elected to the House of Representatives, and the Senate, first ever Indian American being elected as a senator from California. So you have that trend of very increasing influence of the Indian Americans. But at the same time, you've seen the opposition to insourcing of labor and outsourcing of work generate resentments against India. So my sense is India and the US are entering a point where the approach to globalization in the US and the consequences for India, they will be unpredictable. But I think both sides are quite clear. They need to be managed, kept within limits, so that we can build on the positive and limit the negative consequence of individual incidents that you mentioned.
In the first 2 months of President Trump's presidency, how do you rate the performance of the Chinese government in managing disputes, such as the phone conversation with Tsai Ing-wen, leader of Taiwan, and the alleged one China principle that could be negotiated by Trump, the candidate? And such fears and questions could be cited easily to illustrate the existing problems between the two largest economies. How do you rate the performance of the Chinese government?
We have to separate the campaign rhetorics and the policy postures of a politician between the two stages. So before he went to the White House, he said he would, give the definition to make sure that China is the country that manipulates its currency. And secondly, he's going to levy a charge of 40% of the goods coming from China. But he also, as you rightly mentioned, he gave a phone call to Madam Tsai Ing-wen before he gave the call to President Xi Jinping. But I think some 2 months after he went to the White House, he basically has been abiding by the U.S. interests rather than his political rhetorics. In fact, we have found out the learning curve President Trump is going through is much shorter than all the previous presidents who established the relations with China.
You seems more optimistic about Donald Trump looking more presidential after 2 months in the White House. Now, his campaign success might be a blessing for some of the Chinese who were afraid on the campaign trail that he might have been yet another ideologue. In fact, he was unlike Hillary Clinton, yet another presidential hopeful of the Democrats. He didn't put human rights ahead of everything else. Instead of using ideological lens to examine the realities in China, he came across as a businessman, negotiating on a one-on-one basis. Do you think this is also a blessing for India? Of course, you allegedly share the same values. But this guy who's so practical, whatever the unpredictability of his presidency, there's one thing that's for sure. He acts like a businessman.
Yeah, I think there were two aspects where Trump was different from his predecessors. One, he said, look, unlike the predecessors, he said, look, I'm not sure whether globalization is good for the Americans. Second thing, he said, look, unlike the last 25 years, he said, we're not going to impose our values on other people. If you see his inaugural speech, he made that very clear. But that is welcome in Asia all across, because I think the US over-imposition of its, trying to nudge into the internal affairs of other countries has not been good. So India, in that sense, shares that view with the Chinese. But finally, the question is how pragmatic, how practical is the new administration? That's where the problem is, I think, on globalization, on the relationship with major powers, on the question of alliances. This administration seems to be torn between nationalists who want a foreign policy retrenchment, the internationalists who largely want to continue the old policies. How does he find the balance between the two? We don't know that. I mean, I think we'll get to see that only when he meets Xi Jinping and says, look, okay, where exactly
Right, the Chinese leadership may feel relieved when President Trump fails to put ideology ahead of everything else in an age of globalization. Now, are you surprised that President Xi Jinping would choose to visit his American counterpart in Florida after Shinzo Abe, Merkel, Netanyahu all paid their visits to Washington in the hope of figuring out what the presidency of Donald Trump is really like? This is a surprise for you. Your Prime Minister is also going to the United States, by the way.
I mean, no dates have been set, and I think right now it is all the eyes are on President Xi. I think the Chinese are pragmatic. I mean, I think we admire that in the Chinese, though there has been a lot of rhetoric about to China and the confusion that has been generated. I think the Chinese are saying, look, there is a practical way of engaging and doing business with the US leaders. And I think you have had great experience doing that. And I think there is a confidence in Beijing, I think from what I see, that you can actually look at this practically and engage him. And my sense is, Xi, I think, has an opportunity to signal to Trump that, look, don't try to be ideological on one China, two China policies. Let's respect each other's core interests. And if you're willing to address China's sensitivities, China could be helpful for you in creating jobs at home.
In your observation, gentlemen, do you think we have more disputes with the United States than those between Germany and the United States across the Atlantic Ocean? Very short answer, yes or no?
I think the weight of China is so heavy on the US policies, they can't really afford a confrontation.
And your answer?
In terms of common development, President Trump has more new interests with China than with the old partner, Germany.
The next question, therefore, is what do you think of the possibility that President Trump would refuse to shake hands with his Chinese counterpart in front of the media? You know, that happened, unfortunately, between Merkel and Donald Trump. The media was urging President Trump to shake hands with Chancellor Merkel, but President Trump refused to perform this diplomatic protocol, to the surprise and dismay of the Germans. And by the way, they are closest allies.
Because I think, there's a different context. I think the Germans were very critical of Mr. Trump the day after his election. I think Mr. Trump is saying, I have not forgotten it, that you were very critical of me after I got elected. The Chinese have made no such statements, and I think, Mr. Trump is not going to pull Mr. Xi's hand like he did of Mr. Abe, so Mr. Xi's a stronger man. So I think this time both know the stakes are so high, they're not going to play games with this.
President Xi doesn't play golf. He might be able to play ping pong, which served as a diplomatic means to bring the two countries together in 1972 when Richard Nixon came over. That the ping pong diplomacy did lay groundwork for resuming or resumption of the bilateral relationship. What do you think would be happening between these two presidents at the summit instead of using golf as a means?
I think, as I watched, President Trump has 4 priorities for him to start with the first 100 days in office, or for that matter, for the first term of 4 years when he is in the White House. Make America strong again. American first. Infrastructure construction to promote U.S. trade. These are the 4 areas where China and the United States most outstanding convergence of interest. So these 4 cards will be definitely on the cards when President Xi Jinping is with President Trump in Florida, his residence.
Neither could President Trump play cricket. So what would be the thing that can bring India and the United States closer, other than the common values?
I mean, you talk about India and the United States?
Yes.
No, I think, look, we have, as in India as a growing market, has opportunity to help the US, whether it is job creation, whether it is reducing the costs of medical insurances in the US. So India has its value as a future opportunity. But right now, the weight of the Chinese economy is so high, the managing the contradictions with China are immediate priority. For one consideration for us is, if US and China talk about a G2, that is, if there is a collusion between US and China, that will cause problems for India. And similarly, if there is too much of a confrontation too, we would not, like rest of Asia, see such a confrontation.
I'm a little bit surprised at your sense of insecurity between the United States and China, because you are afraid of being sacrificed in any serious negotiations. Do you think during the absence of American leadership from this process of globalization, the Pacific Ocean is big enough to accommodate the needs of the 3 major economies, India, China, and the United States?
No, I think it's big enough. I think what you mentioned is the 4th industrial revolution, in which the Indian scientists are playing a big part. What consequences does it have to the power relationship between the major countries? And that's what we don't know at this point of time. But what I said earlier about US-China collusion is that since it is the most important relationship, that other Asian countries are going to find their own way of dealing with it. Say India getting closer to Japan, India strengthening its ties with other Asian powers.
Are some of the Indian policy observers or makers starting to speculate that China could replace the United States and assume world leadership? If you look at the policy speech of President Xi Jinping in Davos, your answer?
Well, let me just continue with Roger said a minute ago. The Pacific is large enough not only, for the U.S., India, and China to live peace side by side, but also has the potential for 3 parties to work together, because it is for the common interest for the 3 countries, but for the countries in the region and around the world. And with regard to your point, that is your point is
leadership.
Leadership.
World leadership. Whether China is
right at the moment, China is not in the capacity to do that, and China does not have the political will. The Chinese Constitution forbids China to be called superpower, so to speak.
Thank you so much, gentlemen. I hope the world media may spend more time trying to understand the Chinese sense of humility instead of always repeating the word of assertiveness. With that, we come to the end of this edition of Dialogue. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.